When Schirmer described his encounter, the feature he returned to most often was not the craft itself, but the insignia on the being's uniforms. He reported it as a winged serpent, an image positioned like a badge on the chest where police or military personnel would place a rank symbol. Despite uncertainty in other details, this emblem was the one element that never faded from his mind. Researchers at the time took note of its peculiarity, since in 1967 abduction reports rarely included such specific iconography. Most cases described vague humanoid figures or luminous shapes. Clear markings of organization or rank were unusual, making this part of his account stand out. Years later, however, his serpent emblem wouldn't remain an isolated curiosity. In 1979, an abduction in Florida involving Filiberto Cardenas produced a strikingly similar detail. He reported being taken aboard a craft and encountering figures whose uniforms carried serpentine insignias. The parallels between his encounter and Schirmer's earlier memory caught the attention of investigators. At that point, researchers began to suggest that Schirmer's serpent-wing motif might not have been a random invention, but part of a recurring pattern. Further testimony added to the list. In South Carolina during the 1970s, a man named Bill Herman reported uniformed figures who bore serpent-like symbols. In Newfoundland, witnesses of unusual encounters spoke of serpent emblems linked to the beings they saw. In Colombia, cases surfaced where civilians described similar insignias on uniforms. Each report came from different settings, cultures, and witnesses with no connection to one another. Still, the same recurring symbol intruded on their accounts: the serpent, sometimes winged, sometimes stylized, but consistent in its association with uniformed figures. For Schirmer in 1967, there was no way to draw from such testimonies. They had not yet been made. No collections of insignia existed. No catalog of alien crests could have influenced his description. The database of repeating images would only emerge decades later, and it was researchers who painstakingly noticed overlaps across cases long separated by geography and time. By the 1980s, the serpent wing emblem was no longer just Schirmer's lonely detail. It was part of a small but persistent chain of independent reports, each echoing what he had written down more than a decade earlier. Beyond the reports themselves, serpents occupy a notable position in human symbolism. They appear as archetypes across ancient cultures: the feathered serpent of Mesoamerican tradition, the serpent deities of India, and the winged serpents found in Near Eastern accounts. In Western religious texts, serpents often serve as bearers of hidden knowledge or temptation. Because of their recurring presence in myths, some investigators argue that these abduction accounts may be drawing subconsciously from shared cultural imagery rather than external reality. Others propose the reverse, that the beings themselves deliberately use serpent motifs precisely because humans recognize their power and respond to them instinctively. Recent research has even pointed to unusual parallels in the documents, controversial files dating to mid-20th century Spain, in which serpent-like imagery appears within supposed communications from non-human entities. While these files remain debated and often criticized as hoaxes, their inclusion of serpent motifs is what later led some scholars to wonder whether cross-cultural serpent symbolism played a more active role in alleged contact narratives. It is, however, an open question rather than proof. What matters in the context of Schirmer's case is that this emblem, so sharply defined in his regression sessions, later echoed through multiple lines of testimony, myth, and even disputed literature. This repetition raises the possibility that what witnesses describe is not incidental decoration, but a kind of identifying mark. Uniform insignia in human society often signal faction, rank, or allegiance. If non-human groups exist, as abductees claim, their use of recurring crest symbols would likewise suggest organized structure. Whether the serpent emblem belongs to one recurring faction reappearing worldwide, or whether different groups adopted similar imagery independently, remains unresolved. Some researchers interpret the consistency as evidence of a single faction visiting across decades. Others see it as an archetypal image projected differently by disparate witnesses. Both readings remain active areas of debate. What continues to unsettle researchers is the geographic and cultural distance between these reports. Florida, Nebraska, Newfoundland, Colombia, South Carolina, all sites track back to separate witnesses who spoke with different investigators, often in different languages, long before the internet could spread motifs widely. The replication of details before such communication was possible complicates theories of cultural contamination. If the symbol spread, it did so in ways still difficult to explain by ordinary channels. As with the serpent's symbolic weight in myth, scholars disagree on interpretation. Skeptics point to archetypal psychology, suggesting that stress, suggestion, and cultural background might combine to generate serpent imagery in altered states of consciousness. Believers counter that the very durability of such motifs, surfacing spontaneously in isolation across time, suggests contact with an external pattern repeating itself. For them, insignia are not a product of inner fantasy but outward signs of intentional identity, perhaps deliberately displayed to those chosen to witness. However one interprets it, the serpent wing emblem cannot be dismissed as a single unreliable description anymore. Once corroborating reports surfaced, the question evolved from whether Schirmer imagined it to whether we are seeing repeated representations of uniform iconography across independent accounts. For Schirmer personally, the price was that he endured ridicule for mentioning what others at the time saw as absurd embellishment. Yet in retrospect, the emblem became one of the most consistent themes in similar encounters. If the emblem is indeed more than coincidence, it broadens Schirmer's case from an isolated police report into part of a larger trajectory of encounters. On the other hand, if serpent imagery merely reflects the workings of the subconscious, it still remains valuable for showing how powerful archetypal symbols shape abduction testimonies. Either interpretation reinforces why researchers now catalog insignia details carefully. Small images on uniforms, once overlooked, proved to be among the rare threads that tie cases together across decades. The serpent emblem is therefore both a problem and a clue. It problematizes our confidence in which aspects of witness testimony are unique and which are recurrent. But it also points to an element investigators cannot ignore. Some precise images do recur, and they recur in places where ordinary information exchange cannot easily account for them. Seen either as shared archetype or shared identity, they form part of the deeper puzzle of abduction narratives. Yet the emblem was never the only piece of evidence left in Schirmer's case. While his recollections under hypnosis remained contested, the night of December 3rd left physical signs on his person, on his patrol car, and in law enforcement records. Before declaring any conclusion, investigators also had to contend with the traces that existed outside of Schirmer's memory. The overlooked physical evidence. When Herbert Schirmer's case was first documented, what drew most attention were his unsettling memories and the missing stretch of time. But buried beneath those narratives were concrete elements, traces that could be documented, photographed, and tested. This dimension of the case is often sidelined, yet it carries particular weight because many of these details were actually recorded in official channels. Taken together, they represent the overlooked physical evidence: notes in the patrol log, a recorded failure of his radio equipment, a physical welt on his body, visible marks on his patrol car, and fragments of metal collected at the encounter site and submitted for testing. Each of these elements was part of the investigation, and each, in hindsight, points to data that deserved far deeper consideration than it received. The patrol log entry was the first and most undeniable piece. At 2:30 a.m., Schirmer wrote in plain, unembellished language, "Saw UFO at Junction 6 and 63. That logbook was an official record, not his private journal. Everything else, the later memories, the regression, the ridicule, stemmed from a single fact that exists in hard ink. Alongside this was a puzzling radio issue." Sheriff's Department records showed that during the time frame of his sighting, the radio system cut out. No calls went out, none came back in, leaving a break that officers later noted in the operational logs. In 1967, this anomaly was shrugged off as a malfunction, but in later decades, electromagnetic interference has become one of the most frequently recorded technical effects in close encounter cases. Cars stall, electrical systems fail, radios fall silent, precisely the type of shutdown Schirmer said happened when the craft hovered ahead of him. At the time, investigators did not recognize this as a recurring marker, but today that small line in the record looks different. Beyond the official paperwork, there were physical effects on Schirmer himself. Soon after the encounter, he showed colleagues a welt along the side of his neck. The mark lined up with his statement under hypnosis that one of the beings had briefly touched him in that very spot. Whatever created the mark, it was noted by people around him and described in reports. Investigators at the time speculated it could be caused by irritation or stress. But the fact remains, a visible injury appeared, one that he publicly tied to his missing time, and that remained consistent across his later recollections. For a sworn officer with no history of fabricating evidence, the welt stood as an indelible part of his testimony, even if medical analysis of the injury was never properly pursued. Physical wear was also noticed on his patrol car. After returning from that night's shift, Schirmer identified small but unusual impressions on the vehicle's surface. He insisted they had not been there previously. The significance here was less about the marks themselves, because scratches or dents alone could be dismissed, and more about the source. For an officer in a rural town, the patrol car was an extension of his credibility. Every branch scrape, every parking lot ding was familiar. Schirmer argued that these marks dated specifically to the night of the encounter, coinciding with the time when the disc-like object had blocked his path along the highway. That detail never advanced beyond his insistence and the statements of those who looked at the car, but it was observed and discussed as part of the investigation. Then there were the fragments. Chief Richard Watchman, Schirmer, and others went to the reported site along Highway 6 and found pieces of metal scattered near the junction. These were not rumors. The objects were collected and sent for laboratory testing. The lab report, preserved in files later accessed by researchers, did not identify anything unusual. The early analyses concluded the fragments were non-exotic, common metals. Put plainly, metal fragments were recovered and tested. Early lab reports did not identify exotic composition, reported as common metals by initial testing. In other words, nothing looked alien under the limited tools available at the time. But dismissing the fragments entirely ignored context. Common metal can be found in many places, but fragments at the specific intersection of a logged police sighting carried very different implications. Linking location, time, and material, investigators could have asked further questions, but instead the case note of ordinary was treated as final. That response highlights the procedural environment of the 1960s. Standardized forensic protocols for investigating anomalous aerial events simply did not exist. There were no multimodal material tests, no follow-up laboratories cross-checking each other's work, no mandate to preserve chain-of-custody samples. In contrast, today's recommendations from agencies such as NASA's UAP initiative and the scientific guidelines adopted in the Canadian Sky Canada project emphasize preserving sites, conducting repeat analyses, and testing across independent facilities. Injuries are photographed, measured, and scanned. Vehicle malfunctions are logged and retested. Ground fragments are subjected to metallurgical study using advanced techniques such as mass spectrometry and isotope analysis. Put in that light, the dismissal of Schirmer's material traces says more about the limitations of procedure than about the content itself. His case suffered from the absence of structured tools that modern protocols now consider essential. Outside the lab notes, Schirmer also faced personal consequences tied directly to these physical claims. He reported in later interviews that local residents ridiculed him openly. One vivid example he gave was an effigy burned in public meant to mock his story. Whether done in jest or malice, it left a deep impression on him, an act of targeted ridicule that reinforced his loss of standing in the community. For him, the harassment became nearly as visible as the wounds on his skin or the marks on his car. Although not independently verified in official records, these accounts recounted in interviews contributed to his growing sense of isolation and ultimately to his resignation from law enforcement. What remains clear is that the ridicule was real enough to alter the course of his career. Looking back now, these physical traces form a layered picture. A patrol log pinned to a precise time, a radio outage entered into department records, car marks observed by others, a physical welt on the officer himself, and metal fragments collected and lab tested. Each piece recorded in the files, each dismissed in isolation, but together constituting a chain of data points. None of them prove an extraordinary event by themselves, but as a set they show an encounter that left measurable effects beyond memory alone. The path investigators took, treating each element separately, discarding each for ordinary explanations, meant missing the chance to study the interaction between them. Today, modern investigators see these very combinations as red flags worth pursuit. The key lesson is not that extraordinary claims were deliberately suppressed, but that procedural limitations and cultural bias in 1967 prevented the evidence from being treated with scientific rigor. Where one era saw coincidence and malfunction, another sees patterns and testable leads. And in the case of Schirmer, those unpursued leads hint at dimensions of his experience that cannot be explained purely by regression sessions or witness testimony. The overlooked evidence marked him personally as much as it marked the record, leaving scars on his life and career. Yet it also set the stage for the next part of his remarkable account. Because when Schirmer spoke about what happened inside the craft, he didn't just describe figures and insignia. He described being shown technology, machinery, devices, and systems that in 1967 sounded implausible. It is those descriptions, drawn directly from what he reported under hypnosis, that raise some of the most startling comparisons to ideas familiar in aerospace discussions today. The technology they showed him. Under hypnosis, Schirmer said he was brought inside the craft that had blocked his patrol car. What he later emphasized was not only the appearance of the beings, but the machinery they seemed to show him. The central feature, as he described it, was a massive structure he likened to a cocoon or pod, ringed by systems he couldn't place. In his words, it looked like part of an engine, though unlike anything familiar from his training as a naval electrician or from years around automobiles. The technical phrase he used under hypnosis was reversible electromagnetism. This was not a recognized term in physics, but it was the approximation he reached for to describe how the ship appeared to lift, propel, and possibly sidestep gravity without exhaust. Investigators noted that his phrasing was remarkably consistent and avoided flowery exaggeration. He compared what he saw to alternators, heavy coils, and dashboard radar units, the tools he already knew. His descriptions were firmly rooted in the analogies of the late 1960s. To Schirmer, the equipment had recognizable pieces, but their purpose was twisted in unfamiliar ways. He insisted that forces were inverted and pulsed in alternating cycles, helping the object to move without visible fuel. He never claimed to understand the physics, but tried to frame it as best he could. Later commentators would observe that some of his words suggest parallels to ideas later explored in field propulsion, plasma concepts, and ionized drives. Still, those comparisons remain interpretative. The safest position is that his language was metaphorical, not a technical manual. What drew equal attention were his accounts of smaller devices demonstrated to him. During Regression, he reported seeing spheres he called baby moons. These were reflective, football-sized orbs deployed from the craft. He said they hovered and moved independently, suggesting they acted as monitors or scouts. In 1967, such imagery sounded implausible. The idea of autonomous spheres orbiting or patrolling seemed more fantasy than credible detail. Yet as documents now show, orb-like objects have become one of the most commonly recorded categories in UAP reports. In Pentagon briefings, they are referred to as spherical reconnaissance phenomena. The resemblance between that official category and Schirmer's baby moons is difficult to dismiss, though researchers caution that coincidence cannot be excluded entirely. The difficulty of his testimony lies in timing. At the height of the space age, the technologies available to the public and to a municipal police officer were jet engines, rockets, and rudimentary satellites. Concepts such as field propulsion or transmedium operation were far beyond any public discussion. That is why his references to polarity shifts, fuel-free lift, and autonomous orbs were dismissed as science fiction. But decades later, when agencies like NASA confirm active interest in propulsion modes that manipulate electromagnetic fields, the framework for reconsidering his words grows stronger. For example, NASA's 2023 independent UAP study referenced the importance of investigating transmedium objects, craft that cross air and water seamlessly, leaving no conventional propulsion traces. The Pentagon has likewise listed electromagnetic interference and orb-like devices among its highest value unknowns. These acknowledgments don't prove Schirmer was right, but they do place his once dismissed details back into serious discussion. The so-called baby moons illustrate that shifting context. For years, glowing spheres associated with UFOs were brushed off as balloons, lanterns, or atmospheric illusions, but patterns accumulated. Farmers spoke of orbs that paced tractors at exact distance. Pilots reported spheres flying alongside their wings without deviation. Soldiers described them hovering above weapons stockpiles. Their behavior was consistent enough to imply guidance. When Schirmer called them miniature moons, he reflected the era in which Earth satellites fascinated the public. Today, his language can easily be read as describing aerial drones or probes. That does not confirm his report, but the overlap between terms is striking. Critical question is how much Schirmer understood. Under hypnosis, was he truly recounting engineered mechanisms, or was he bending alien shapes into the vocabulary of mechanics he knew? Some researchers suggest the term reversible electromagnetism may itself have been placed in his mind during the encounter, technical enough to impress but imprecise in detail. Others argue it was an honest attempt to describe field-based systems using analogies like coils, magnetos, and instruments. The fact that his descriptions use limited and consistent references favors the latter view. Whatever he saw, he described it within the boundaries of his education, anchoring it to technology he recognized. Where this testimony touches history most sharply is the Cold War backdrop. In the late 1960s, propulsion claims that hinted at field manipulation would have unsettled policymakers. Advanced aerospace knowledge, if real, was sensitive material. For this reason, some observers theorized that the atmosphere of the Cold War amplified caution and secrecy around anomalous propulsion claims. While this interpretation cannot be proven, it explains why Schirmer's words could be marked down as fantasy rather than treated as possible technical observation. Marginalizing his account was administratively simpler than confronting its implications. This framing provides a way to understand both the ridicule he endured and the way physical traces were quietly filed away. His talk of propulsion pods and orbs fit nowhere in 1967 doctrine, and so they were left hanging as dreamlike fragments. Yet the persistence of those very categories in later studies has made his testimony stand out in retrospect. The cocoon-like engine, the polarity shifts, the sphere-like drones, these details haven't vanished. Instead, they keep returning in different forms in modern data archives. His experience raises the issue of whether he was briefly shown more than a passing glimpse. Accounts of abduction often contain mundane or confusing elements, but Schirmer's recall pointed to systematic demonstrations of the craft's workings. If intentional, that choice suggests structured disclosure. The human was being given fragments of comprehension appropriate to his skills. That interpretation, however, remains speculation. What can be said with certainty is that his words captured enough detail to remain anchored in the record long after ridicule would have buried most cases of the time. From today's standpoint, his testimony reads as a collision between limited vocabulary and extraordinary imagery. Where he saw a cocoon engine and spoke of reversible electromagnetism, modern readers see the outlines of concepts still under exploration in propulsion research. Where he spoke of baby moons, official reports now log spheres acting purposefully near unknown craft. The lessons are suggestive but not conclusive. They don't endorse his story as verified reality. They remind us that anomalous experiences often contain fragments worth preserving, if only so that future contexts can test them against accumulating data. Schirmer, however, did not only describe technology. In those same sessions, he reported words spoken directly to him, words that resonated with his occupation and changed the interpretation of his entire night. Those phrases would prove as enduring and as puzzling as the images of orbs and engines. They hinted at why a young Nebraska patrolman was chosen in the first place. Law enforcement and the Watchman role.